I'm Helio Fred Garcia, and my day job is as the president of the Logos Consulting Group. We are a consulting firm that helps organizations of all sizes around the world make choices when the stakes are very high. Primarily choices intended to help them maintain the trust and confidence of those who matter to them. Most of our clients are big corporations. A number of our clients are NGOs and other kinds of non-governmental organizations that do good work in the world. And for the last 15 and a half years, one of those clients has been Religions for Peace. For the last 6 years, I've also had the honor of serving on the board of Religions for Peace. In addition to the work I do with clients, I'm also a professor at a number of universities. I teach both management and communication at New York University, both in the executive MBA program of the Stern School of Business and in the School of Professional Studies, which gives master's degrees in other professional disciplines. I'm also on the faculty of Columbia University, where I teach ethics in the Fu Foundation School of Engineering and Applied Science. And I'm a senior fellow at the Communication University of China in Beijing, where I teach usually 1 week at a time intensives on crisis response and crisis management. Almost all of my philanthropic work for the last 20 years has been in the area of multi-religious cooperation and multi-religious justice work. In the United States, that has included being board chair of a multi-religious seminary affiliated with the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, California. It also included being the board chair of the Interfaith Alliance in Washington, D.C. In both of those U.S. entities, most of our work had to do with maintaining religious pluralism in the United States and serving as the bulwark against government intrusion into religion and the protection of religious minorities, especially during times of stress. My international multi-religious focus has been with Religions for Peace, and in particular with the International Secretariat of Religions for Peace. I and my firm have been advisors to Dr. Bill Vent, the Secretary General, and to the senior staff of Religions for Peace. And on behalf of Religions for Peace, I've had the privilege of going around the world and helping Religions for Peace tell its story as effectively as possible in a number of circumstances. It began soon after the United States invaded Iraq, when I was asked to travel to Amman, Jordan, for the formative meeting of the Iraqi Interreligious Council for Peace. And part of my job was to serve as the communication officer at that meeting and to convene the press conference that documented the success of that meeting at the end of that meeting. Some years later, my firm and I were in Kyoto, Japan, where we served as the primary communication resource along with our Japanese partners at the World Assembly of Religions for Peace in Kyoto. And part of my role there was to be the convener of press conferences with religious leaders and with multi-religious leaders collectively to tell the story of Religions for Peace out into the world. In 2011, I was in Marrakesh, Morocco, for the formative meeting of the MENA Council, the Middle East North Africa Interreligious Council for Peace. And part of my job there was to help manage the communication around that meeting. And then finally, I was in Vienna for the World Assembly of Religions for Peace just several years ago, where I was the primary spokesperson for the Assembly and also presided over the press conferences and had the good fortune to interview a number of religious leaders for social media about their experience of Religions for Peace. One of the things that I think is most significant about Religions for Peace is that over the decades of its existence, it has made steady progress in finding ways to bring together religious communities that on the surface might have less in common with each other than we know them to have. One of the signal challenges in the world today is the hijacking of religious identity for purposes other than religion, and the use of those religious identities for purposes that are frankly negative and scary. And one of the things that Religions for Peace has been extraordinarily effective in doing is to find the common ground among religious communities, focusing on the deeply shared but widely held values that allow all the religious communities with which Religions for Peace operates to work constructively together. Religions for Peace has also been extremely effective in helping religious leaders harness the moral authority of religious community for the proper purposes. That includes sustainable development, that includes conflict transformation, that includes protecting the most vulnerable. And as Religions for Peace has gotten more and more effective, bringing more and more religious communities into relationship with each other, there's been this extraordinary effect of religious communities seeing the example from others and wanting to find a way to do those kinds of things with their own religious communities. When I look at the difference between how Religions for Peace operated when I first got to know them 15 and a half years ago and how they're operating now, the method hasn't changed very much. But what has changed is the recognition of the effectiveness of this process and of this method. And we continue to make meaningful progress in bringing together communities that on the surface might be in dispute with each other, but to recognize that there's far more that unifies those communities than that separates those communities. To be clear, the book that I recently published called The Agony of Decision, Mental Readiness and Leadership in a Crisis is written primarily for a non-religious audience. And it has to do with ways to make smart choices quickly when trust and confidence are on the line. Now, I do, in the book, make some reference to religious communities that have not done as good a job as they could have done in making these kinds of choices. But whether it's religious communities or business entities or governments, what I focus on in the book is that the key to making good choices when stress is at play is a process that I call mental readiness. And mental readiness consists of three related dimensions. The first is what I call emotional discipline. And that is the ability to remain calm even as panic and frustration and worry and anxiety permeate in the community at large. And the most effective leaders are able to remain calm, even to force calm, so that they can avoid making impulsive negative decisions. Another essential part of emotional discipline is humility. And one of the things I point to in the book, and I actually quote His Holiness the Pope, Pope Francis, is that the most effective leaders have this paradoxical combination of fierce resolve and deep humility. And it is this combination of resolve and humility that allows them not only to make smart choices, but to make smart choices by empathizing with those who are most directly affected by whatever the circumstance is. And the fierce resolve without that humility makes it very difficult for leaders to take into consideration the needs and concerns of those directly affected in these kinds of situations. So the first dimension of mental readiness is emotional discipline. The second is what I call deep knowledge. And one of the things we find by studying crises and similar events where trust is at risk is that they tend to follow predictable patterns. So there are certain things that we know never work. And when we look at failed crisis after failed crisis, it's when the leaders try to do something that we know never works. They ignore, deny, blame others, try to prevaricate, but they don't directly address the problem at large. We know that that never works, and if we can get people to stop doing what never works, we'll end up with a better outcome. We also know what always works. And one of the things that always works is to genuinely care about the victims in a crisis. And the more we can get leaders to genuinely care about those who are affected by a crisis, the more trust and confidence will remain high. We also know that there are certain things that work in certain circumstances, and the circumstances in which they will work and won't work. And one of the advantages of deep knowledge is it gives us the ability to make wise choices without having to learn those lessons by suffering the consequence of making poor choices. In other words, we can piggyback off of other people's poor choices and harvest the wisdom of those poor choices and allow ourselves to be more likely to make the smart choices. The third dimension of mental readiness is what I call intellectual rigor. And intellectual rigor says that, as in any other management process, there's a rigor to getting it right. But that rigor requires that we make certain judgments in a certain order. And the most effective leaders ask the right questions in the right order. And the worst question to ask when something is going wrong is some version of what should we do or what should we say? Because those questions put the leader squarely in a self-protective framework. And so the leader ends up saying dumb things like, I'd like my life back, or I am not a crook. But the more productive decisions come when we ask the right question, which is thinking about those who matter to us. What would reasonable people appropriately expect a responsible leader to do when facing this kind of circumstance? And the reason that's the right question is that trust is a consequence of expectations that are met. And if we ask questions about the expectations of those who matter to us, we can end up fulfilling those expectations far more readily, and as a result, trust remains high. Whether it's a religious leader or a business leader or a government leader, that trust is an essential element of effectiveness. And the more we can make choices that preserve that trust, the more likely we are to get through adversity effectively. One of the remarkable things about Religions for Peace is that it asks leaders whose communities are deeply in turmoil to make choices that might in the moment seem quite risky, but that allows them to ultimately be in relationship with other communities that might previously have seemed more adversarial. One of the remarkable leadership skills of Dr. Mendeleev, the Secretary General, is that he has been able over time to show that he delivers on his promise, that he fulfills the expectations that he helps religious leaders set. And one of the things that religious leaders find themselves over and over having to do is to use their moral authority to get those whom they lead to stop doing things that they are inclined to do, and instead to be in relationship with people who previously were difficult to be in relationship with. That requires extraordinary trust. And one of the things that I have found most impressive about the work of Religions for Peace is that they've been able to sustain this building of trust over years and over decades. And we find ourselves growing as a movement and growing as a community and a set of religious communities, so that now we are building on previous successes, even as we bring more and more people into the fold.